Xi Jinping and the Chinese are kind of lording it over them because now, uh, compared to 5 or 10 years ago, China has grown exponentially in terms of military and economic power, whereas Russia has really shrunken
Yeah.
and is now essentially fighting for its life against its neighbor Ukraine.
To what extent then does this relationship between Putin and Xi pose a threat to the West? What would a no limits partnership look like?
Well, I think that the idea of no limits between Putin and Xi was discredited within a matter of weeks when Putin turned around and launched an ill-fated military attack on the Ukraine that instantly bogged down. I think the limits to their partnership have become pretty clear since then. But maybe the way to think about it is as a limited partnership. And as a partnership, where the two countries have overlap in their own self-interested agendas in many respects. I think that their collaboration does, in fact, pose a very real threat to the West, to the global system, to the US, to the UK. I mean, we see both China and Russia seeking to weaken NATO and to drive wedges between across the Atlantic, the Pacific, among European partners. We see them increasing their military capabilities, their own military coordination in the form of exercises and so on. So they're
Mm.
trying to weaken the credibility of NATO and of the US as a security guarantor. We see them coordinating in international organizations in ways that block uh, the US and the UK and undermine the principles of the UN Charter. And we see them conducting information and ideological operations in the West to undermine liberal democracy as a
Yeah.
system.
Look,
So there's a lot going on that
yeah.
is not good for us.
We know that China poses a threat, particularly in terms of cybersecurity, but also dominance of trade. We are reliant on China here in the UK, as are many other Western countries on China for specific elements of trade. We know that Russia is a threat. We know that Vladimir Putin seems irrational in his opinions. Obviously, he is entitled to them, but we know what kind of character he is, and that Russia is, doesn't operate with any level of democracy. So we know that both countries are a threat. Combined, where do you put them on the scale of danger to the kind of global world order? Let's just spell this out very quickly, because I think some listeners might be thinking, well, we hear about China all the time, but ultimately they're no match for us in the West. How dangerous could both the components of China and Russia be?
Well, look, I think there's an important clue in the fact that it wasn't just Vladimir Putin who came to Beijing. It was a huge delegation from Russia, from his government, with economic and financial experts, with defense and military experts. That should tell us that what we're seeing is a kind of business conference that's working on upgrading the Sino-Russian axis in both the short term and the long term. So I think that that means that we should expect that the sum is greater than just the two parts, that
Mm.
China and Russia working together form a more formidable challenge to global governance, to the rule of law, to democratic systems, to an open global market than either of them by themselves. I mean, we shouldn't caricature them, we shouldn't exaggerate, but look at the military cooperation that they are pursuing and that is growing. For one thing, even though the Chinese aren't taking the risk of selling arms directly to Russia, Chinese companies are providing inputs that are helping Putin sustain the war against the Ukraine. Even more than that, develop a defense industrial structure that poses a threat to the Baltics, to Finland, to Poland, to NATO. so that's not just Russia alone. That combination is quite worrisome and potentially
Yeah.
powerful.
Look, Chinese
There's
exports to
financial
Russia.
coordination. I'm sorry, there's
Go on.
financial coordination as well, uh, in which they're both trying to undermine the US dollar and insulate against Western sanctions. So the better that one of the two becomes in developing these evasive measures, the less ability the West will have in reining in either of them by using sanctions.
And I should say that Chinese exports to Russia, to kind of illustrate your point here, Chinese exports to Russia have risen by 60% since
Yeah.
the invasion of Ukraine. Where does the anti or why has the anti-American sentiment emerged to this extent? I wonder what the historical context is underpinning this attitude.
Um, yeah, I wouldn't start by describing it as anti-American. I think that first and foremost, these are two very nationalistic leaders, authoritarian leaders of countries that once enjoyed, glorious imperial status and have a dream of restoring their nations to what they consider to be a rightful place in global leadership. So this what they're doing is very much about what they want, and the U.S. is an impediment, along with NATO, along with the EU, along with uh, the Western uh, bloc, is an impediment to their being able to operate the way that they want. Yes, they feel threatened by the US, but more importantly, they are threatened to the extent that international institutions hold them and their leaders accountable
Mm,
for the way they treat their own people or what they do with their neighbors. So they're all Leninists. They see this in terms of struggle. And even though China and Russia are quite different, I think that the hostility and the tensions we're seeing towards the United States and towards the West aren't really a response to what the West is doing, but is an offshoot of the ambition they have to be able to exploit the international system without consequence.
yeah, yeah, and there's been mention today of how they both feel about close military political alliances in the Asia Pacific region. She says China is threatened by the development of pro-Western groupings such as AUKUS, Australia, UK, and the US, which might be soon joined by Japan. Could they turn on each other? Could Putin turn on Xi?
Well, in many respects, they are very unnatural bedfellows. It is not an easy fit, and Russia and China have repeatedly clashed in their histories, including in the Cold War era, where there was a very profound and consequential divide between Moscow and Beijing. As I've said before, I think this is a marriage of convenience. They are brought together not by any kind of real common ideology or common ambition for global governance, but by self-interest, and that much of their cooperation is tactical. You see, for example, that the Chinese will not give the Russians what the Russians are asking for in terms of direct military support, because the Chinese are just not going to pay a price for any support they give to Putin. It's interesting that Xi Jinping hosts Putin just a week after his visit to Europe,
Yeah,
his
France,
meeting with,
Serbia, Hungary. Yeah, yeah.
and importantly with the commission head von der Leyen. So I think, on the one hand, he is protecting China's equities with the Europeans. He's reassuring them that, oh, China's not really helping the Russians, don't you worry. Now, this week, he's protecting China's equities with Russia. The geopolitical partnership, yeah, but I think more importantly is for Xi Jinping, the reliable access to energy and to commodities at bargain
Mm.
basement prices. So you can be sure that Putin doesn't appreciate the fact that the Chinese are really gouging Russia by getting gas and oil at below market
Yeah,
rates.
yeah.
You can also be sure that Putin doesn't appreciate the ways that Xi Jinping and the Chinese are kind of lording it over them because now, uh, compared to 5 or 10 years ago, China has grown exponentially in terms of military and economic power, whereas Russia has really shrunken
Yeah.
and is now essentially fighting for its life against its neighbor Ukraine.
Look, it's been fascinating to speak to you. Thank you so much, Danny Russell, Vice President for the International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Good to speak to you. Thank you.